I'm delighted that we can now proceed to a terrific conversation with somebody who probably doesn't need an introduction based on the registrant's comments that we got. Welcome, Guy Raz, to Authors and Innovators. We're so pleased that you're here. And it's we've had a terrific 2 days of conversation around change makers, and how the future is now. So we'll go ahead and have our staff unmute you so that we can talk more about how I built this. And I will tell you that Guy, I know that you couldn't be here in person, but I want you to know that New England is just as you left it. Here at the Babson campus, we are enjoying a snowstorm, and we have about an inch of snow on the ground. So wherever it is that you are today, I suspect in the Bay Area or somewhere warmer, it is a much better place than it is here along Route 128, which I know you remember well. Well, Guy, if we can get you to hit mute, unmute yourself.
Unmute. Okay, can you hear me now?
There you go. Perfect. Well,
okay, great.
Welcome. So pleased
you.
to see you, and so happy to talk about how I built
you.
this at our 4th annual Authors and Innovators. Guy doesn't need any introduction, but I'll try to do it a little bit of justice for those folks who don't know. Guy Raz is the host, co-creator, and editorial director of 3 NPR programs, including 2 of its most popular ones, the TED Radio Hour and How I Built This. Both shows are heard by more than 14 million people each month. And I know Guy is also the creator and proud co-host of NPR's first ever podcast for kids, Wow in the World. How I Built This, of course, is one of my favorite podcasts. It's about great innovators, entrepreneurs, and idealists, and the stories behind the movements they have built. Guy has now taken all of his greatest hits. I think Jennifer Hyman talks about this from Rent to Runway in the book, and said you've now turned all of your greatest hits into a how-to manual, and it's a terrific one. Guy, from you, I want to take you back to Brandeis. So you go from Brandeis, you spend some more time getting a degree in history, you spend time as a Nieman Fellow, you then spend time covering wars. How does a guy who's a serious historian and journalist end up being the guy who chronicles business stories?
I have no idea. It's it wasn't a plan. I always wanted to be a journalist. I was a student journalist. I loved journalism and I loved reporting. But what I realized, Larry, early on in my career as a reporter, because I was very, very fortunate early in my career. I started in 1997 at NPR. And by the year 2000, I was the bureau chief in Berlin. I mean, it was kind of a crazy meteoric rise that then precipitated a meteoric crash later on, but which we can come to. But at a very young age, I was very lucky, and I was able to be overseas for 6.5 years as a reporter, first with NPR and then with CNN. And I was able to travel and report from 50 countries. I covered 4 wars. I mean, the Iraq War and Afghanistan and Israel-Palestine and wars in the Balkans. But what I realized fairly early on in my career was that I was never going to be able to outcompete the best reporters at the kinds of things reporters are rewarded for, which is breaking news and investigative stories. That wasn't really what drove me and what I was passionate about. What I was passionate about was showing up in a village in Iraq and meeting a family and telling their story and giving my listeners a window, into the world of that war through their story. And that is how I reported overseas. That's really how I began to kind of build the style that I have, which is to tell stories and to offer big ideas, advice, inspiration, whatever you want to call it, but through the prism of somebody's own story. And that's so the journey from being a reporter and doing what I do today is actually, even though it would have been surprising, had you told me 15 years ago I would be creating programs around business issues and entrepreneurs, it actually isn't that incongruous when you think about it, because the core, the foundation of my career really began in a form of storytelling. And that's basically what I do today.
And that's how you start the book, which is so compelling. You talk about Stacey Brown from Chicken Salad Chick, and how that moved your wife Hannah so much that you had that gotcha moment.
Yeah.
Talk a bit about that.
I love Stacey so much. I mean, here's a crazy thing, Larry. As a journalist, you're trained to be distant from the subject that you interview and kind of be the voice of God. And I don't consider myself to be a journalist anymore, for a variety of reasons. The reality is, when I interview somebody now for How I Built This, I am telling their hero's journey, their life story about how they built a brand. And that could be Howard Schultz or Richard Branson or Stacey Brown or Jamie Siminoff of Ring or Sarah Blakely of Spanx, all of whom have been on the show. I interview them for 3, 4, 5 hours sometimes. I just got out of a 5-hour interview yesterday with the founder of Jazzercise, Judy
Wow.
Shepard-Missette, an incredible, inspiring woman. She revolutionized aerobics exercise in the US. Now, if you interview somebody in an intimate setting for 5 hours and you are asking granular questions about their life and you really are trying to understand it, there's no way you can't walk out of that having developed some kind of bond with that person. And Stacey Brown is an example of that. She was a single mom. Her ex-husband left, and she was on her own with a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. She had not had any work experience because she stayed at home with the kids. She was a graduate of Auburn University. She was living in Auburn, Alabama, and she needed to make money. And she started to make and sell chicken salad to teachers at teachers' lounges, PTA meetings, door to door from an ice chest. And at a certain point, a friend of hers said, "This chicken salad's terrific. Why don't I help you open a little shack? And we can maybe make a luncheonette." And then the rent was like $500 a month. And I don't want to give away the whole story because you can hear it on How I Built This, or you can read about it in the book. But it is a story of extraordinary, extraordinary triumph and extraordinary loss and devastating sadness and personal tragedy. But also, today that business is a $100 million business. It's called Chicken Salad Chick. It's one of the fastest growing fast casual chains in the South. And it all began out of an ice chest from a woman who had no experience in business and was left with nothing. And it's an incredible story. And I encounter these stories again and again and again. Every single week we put out an episode of How I Built This.
And you can feel your passion for these folks. And I liked that you started in the book with the premise that, look, entrepreneurship is not natural. And you answered the basic question that so many of our viewers, more than 300 of them today, Guy, are asking: where do I find good ideas? You talk about so many good ideas in the book. Where do I find a good idea?
Yeah. And let me clarify this idea, because I think it's an important point you make about entrepreneurship not being natural. The natural state of humans is to avoid risk, is to avoid danger, right? That's why we are here on this planet, because we saw the saber-toothed tiger and we went the opposite direction. And starting a business is like charging the saber-toothed tiger. I mean, you are basically saying, okay, I'm going to deal with rejection, the possibility of failure, maybe financial collapse and catastrophe, all the things that we're wired not to do as humans. So becoming an entrepreneur takes a lot of work and a lot of practice. And I have come to the belief and the realization over the last 5 years of really diving into the world of entrepreneurship and studying entrepreneurs, and realizing that it is something that is learned. These are a series of traits and skills that we all have the capacity to learn. Now, to your question, when it comes to ideas and finding good ideas, look, in some ways, this is the easiest part about starting a business. You have an idea. It's exciting. You talk about it with everybody you know. You imagine your product on the shelves of Walmart. But then comes the hard part. You got to have a business plan. You've got to find investors. You got to find out what factories you can produce this product in. You've got to figure out a marketing and distribution strategy. I mean, it's very complex and a series of problems to be solved, which is what makes starting a business so exciting. But how do people come up with ideas? The answer is fairly simple. I mean, not coming up with a good idea is not easy, but the concept of it is relatively simple. It is trying to identify a problem out in the world that you have, that you need to solve, that will solve it for yourself and for lots of other people. So if it's a problem that just you have, you remember the movie The Jerk with Steve Martin?
Oh, sure.
He solved the problem that he had, which was, he pulled off the glasses. I can't remember what it was called, with that little, but not a problem most people have. Most people are perfectly happy doing that with their glasses. You need to solve a problem that you have and lots of other people have, and or improve on a service or a product that's out there that can be made better. And that's essentially what a business is. And for many of the people I've interviewed, it comes in sort of moments of searching. A great example is the story of Away suitcases. Jen Rubio, who is a wonderful entrepreneur, brilliant entrepreneur, was working for a jeans company and in the UK as a marketing person, and she was really searching for a business idea. She really wanted to start a business. She had worked for Warby Parker as a social media director, so she was already immersed in that world. And she was on a trip in Europe and in the airport and carrying her suitcase with her, and it began to break apart. And that was her aha moment. When she got back to New York, she started going to TJ Maxx and Marshalls and all of these stores, looking at suitcases, buying them, examining them, starting to research the industry. And she realized that in the suitcase market, there were, your standard suitcases that everyone buys at TJ Maxx or Target. And then there are the super high-end Tumi and Louis Vuitton bags that are so expensive, they're inaccessible. But there was no really well-made sort of moderate to high-end bag that was reasonably priced, that was within reach. And that was the genesis of what became Away suitcases, which was, last year valued at $1 billion. So that's really how it happens. It's about keeping your eyes open and looking out for problems in the world that need to be solved.
And you've got to be a bit of an optimist. You talked a bit about rational optimism in your recent conversation with the folks from Life is Good. How would you think about that? What would you say to our viewers today who say, gee, the world has changed. Should I still do this?
Larry, optimism is a really, really complex idea, right? Because we don't want to be naive. We're living in a very difficult time right now. We're a week away from an election that I think a lot of us have anxiety over and about what's going to happen in the days and weeks afterwards. We're living at a time where a significant percentage of the American population, believes that the other side is socialist or whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's a very, very scary time. What I mean by optimism, and I'm inspired by the Jacobs brothers, the founders of Life is Good, this idea of rational optimism, which means it's not that you can't be skeptical of things. It's not that you can't be suspicious of things or that you can't be worried about things, but it's that you have to essentially accept that that any kind of pursuit, any kind of idea that's worth putting out into the world, is, if it's worth doing, it will take time, and
it could be hard.
You have to see far out. It's like it's a cliche, but everything is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And when it comes to the idea of optimism, yes, entrepreneurs are optimistic about their ideas, but it doesn't mean that they don't have moments of self-doubt. It doesn't mean that they don't have moments of lying on the bathroom floor crying about whether this thing is going to work or whether they can make payroll. I mean, that's also an important part of the process. You have to interrogate your idea. You have to interrogate your own assumptions all the time. It's really important. But ultimately, when you believe that the idea that you have is an idea that the world needs, that can be a really powerful force. I mean, I think about Tristan Walker and Bevel Razors. He's an African-American man. He knew that, the moment he started to shave, that he would get painful razor bumps on his skin. And that's because men, mainly brown and black men and men with very curly hair, when you shave, the hair grows right back into your skin. And he wanted to create a razor that would solve this problem for men of color. And he went to investors, and most of those investors were white, and they were sympathetic, but they didn't see this as a problem. They couldn't see it. They couldn't understand how this was a problem. But Tristan Walker knew. He knew there were tens of millions of men and women around the world who had this problem, who needed this problem to be solved. And it didn't matter that he heard 100 no's or 1,000 no's. He kept moving forward because he knew intuitively that if he couldn't solve that problem, nobody could. But he knew it was a problem that had to be solved, and that's what made him optimistic. That's what kept him moving forward.
Rational optimism. Guy, I'm getting bombarded from our viewers. I'm gonna read you some questions. I'm going to take 3 in particular, and you should know, Guy, that each of these folks will be receiving a signed copy of How I Built This.
Wow.
So,
awesome.
Our first question comes from Ashley Lucas from Babson College. Guy, the majority of entrepreneurs in the world will not grow their companies to be $100 million businesses. How do we communicate to individuals that building impactful startups, which may never make it big, is just as meaningful as building the ones that do?
I love that question. Ashley, I want you to amplify that idea from the rafters, from the rooftops. It's so important. Look, How I Built This is it's a realistic look at what it's like to build a business. But of course, we focus on huge companies, Starbucks and Ring and Virgin and Impossible Foods and Airbnb and Slack. Why do we do that? Because we're also a business and we want people to listen to the shows. And if it was a show that focused on a really great local grocery store, our audience would be much smaller, and it would be harder to have a scaled show with which could be a sustainable business and could employ lots of people and do what we do. That being said, every time I have an opportunity to say this, I say it. The corner grocery store in your community that is profitable is a better business than Uber, which has never made a dime. Okay. Right. Many of these startups and unicorns have never made any money, have never turned a profit. I think that attitude is starting to change now, especially in the VC world, where VCs are starting to say, you know what, maybe this approach wasn't right. Maybe we need to start focusing on companies that are profitable. Dropbox is a great example. It was profitable from day one. And there are lots of other consumer products. Jazzercise. I just interviewed, I interviewed the founder of Jazzercise. They were profitable from day one. And they were lean and mean. And so I think that the idea of success isn't, a successful business isn't a massive scaled $100 million, billion-dollar company. It's a company that is sustainable, that can sustain a person's life, can give you fulfillment, can maybe employ 1 or 2 other people and give them sustainable lives. My dad ran a very successful business. When he was 42 years old, he opened up a jewelry store selling pearls. He had no experience in this. He was an engineer. He had worked for defense contractors in Southern California, but he wanted to be his own boss, and he decided to start selling pearls. Now, did he become a millionaire? No. He never made him rich, but he was able to raise 4 kids. He was able to employ 7 people over the 35 years that he was in business. He closed it down. He didn't sell it to anybody. He didn't make it was no payday at the end. He was left with merchandise that he had to liquidate, but he's retired. He was able to have a great life and raise 4 kids. And that is, to me, that is the definition of a successful enterprise.
Isn't that true? And this book is for them too.
It's exactly for them. That's exactly who it's for.
Our next question comes from Michael Welts, who's the CMO at Wasabi. And Michael asks, Guy, in 1899, the commissioner of the U.S. Patent Office said, quote, "Everything that can be invented has been invented." What do you think your guests would say about this prediction 120 years later?
I love that so much. It's so cool. Can you imagine 20 years ago, 15 years ago, if someone said to you, we're all going to be walking through airports like this,
right.
Or we're going to be walking down the street like this. I would not have been happy about that. I'm not happy about it. But the point is that we could not have imagined how smartphones, the iPhone in particular, has changed the way we behave, the way I mean, we have now a portal to infinite knowledge, right, at our fingertips. You look at right now at the pandemic, right, this past year, and you look at what kinds of opportunities will come out of this moment. I mean, we can only begin to imagine. We can start to see the contours of that future, right? Think about a brand like Zoom, which, by the way, its stock price went from like $20 to $600 this year. So, woe is me for not putting $10 into that company. But Zoom is to the pandemic. I mean, Zoom is to communication today what I think CompuServe and Prodigy were to the early internet. Now, it's good. It's just not good enough. It's not immersive enough. There are so many opportunities now to completely revolutionize hybrid and also distant virtual communications, because that is going to be the future. It doesn't mean we're not going to gather again. We have to gather. We are social animals. We need to be together. But what it means is that the future will be a lot more hybridization, especially as more people now realize they don't have to live in San Francisco or New York or Boston, expensive cities. They can live in Boise, Idaho, or Omaha, Nebraska, or Charlestown, West Virginia, which, by the way, will be really good for America to get that, to a reverse
Right.
brain drain, to get smart people into these cities where they left for so long. So I think that we're going to see incredible innovation come out of this pandemic. How do we interact? How do we communicate? I mean, even you look at the real estate industry. I mean, it's been booming this year, which is shocking, right? You would not have thought that would happen. A lot of sales are happening through virtual tours. The
Right.
real estate industry has really pioneered the virtual home tour that has made it immersive and really allows you to feel what it's like to be in that home. So I think there's so many opportunities in the travel and leisure industry. I mean, which have been really hit hard. What is travel going to look like in the future? And these are very small incremental innovations I'm talking about. We can't even begin to imagine what's going to happen with nanotechnology. What's going to come out of biotech. I mean, the Nobel Prize winner Jennifer Doudna, who won it for CRISPR
Right.
technology, in 100 years, we might be looking back at cancer and in the same way that we now look at, bloodletting and leeches, right? Or giving somebody a swig of whiskey during the Civil War and amputating their leg, right? So I mean, that idea, of course, is a wonderful quote, but of course, it's totally absurd, right? I mean, what will happen in the next 100 years will blow our minds if we could have that crystal ball today.
Mary Belezza asks, Guy, what was the single most important piece of advice that you received and followed that was critical to your success?
It's a great question. I received so much advice during my time. I think the most important piece of advice that I have received and have really followed is listen. My superpower is not my intelligence. I'm not more intelligent than you. I'm not, you know, more connected. Um, I'm just very curious, and that's a choice that we can all make. I think curiosity is much more important than intelligence, because if you're curious, your mind is open and you're willing to learn from everybody you meet. And that's actually a piece of advice I got early on, which was, and I'm sure you've heard a version of this, which is surround yourself with people who are smarter than you.
Right.
And every person you encounter is an opportunity to learn, is an opportunity to grow. And I am who I am today because of the people I met in college and and after that and before that, and my wife, and all these inputs, all these brilliant people. The music I listen to today, heavily influenced by people I met in college. The ideas in my mind. So that's one of them. The other thing is listening. Listening is a superpower that we all have the capacity to develop. Most of us spend too much of our time talking, but listening to somebody is honoring them. And it can be one of the most powerful ways to develop a relationship, to convince somebody if you're having a debate, just by listening, by acknowledging their ideas, by actively listening, and by asking questions, based on the things that they're telling you. That's what I do and how I built this. And that is why I'm able to get people to really open up, because really all I'm doing is using my emotional energy to listen to them. And that's been really valuable in my career.
I want to talk a bit more about that, uh, and have you talk about the active listening and authentic listening that you do, because I think it's one of the reasons so many of us listen to the podcast. I've read, and I think I listened to you tell Tim Ferriss on a podcast that when people come on or agree to come on How I Built This, you say to them, I'm going to be, are you willing to answer anything? Are you willing to, quote, surrender? And have you had folks who agree to that and then say, I'm not sure I can do this?
Well, I'm very careful at being very explicit in what I mean when I have a phone call with them. I want them to say no at that point. And because these are always off the record conversations. I'm not going to tell you the people who have not agreed to come on the show. It's not many, but we part as friends. I'm not there to embarrass them. I want them to understand that How I Built This and their story will not land in the same way, will not have the same emotional resonance and impact if it's if they're plugging something, or if it's a polished publicity event. It has to be real. It has to be authentic. The reason why, Larry, you listen to the show and I listen to the show, because I'm a listener too, is because I don't want to hear Howard Schultz talk about the success of Starbucks. I want to hear him talk about his personal anguish. I want him to hear him talk about his dad and his dad's, alcoholism. And I want to hear people talk about moments when they felt alone and abandoned. And because that's when we connect with them. That's when we say, holy smokes, like I am like Howard Schultz or Sarah Blakely or Tristan Walker. They're like me. The person who invented Ring, Airbnb, Uber, not Uber, Lyft, um, they have vulnerabilities too. And so that's very important. I need that person to come onto the show willing to take us into their internal dialogue or monologue. We're all, we all live in our own movies. You live in your movie, I live in mine, all of you watching live in yours. That's consciousness. We walk around, we look left and right. It's our story, right? It's our point of view. What I'm trying to do on the show is get a seat in the cockpit of that person's brain, kind of like in Star Wars, or Star Trek, and bring you along with me. You're in the passenger seat with me, all 3.5 million of you. Really, you are. And we're trying to see your story and your flaws too, because your flaws are part of what make you you. No one is perfect. And the whole point of How I Built This is to show that these people that are so successful and have done so well in business are just like you. They're imperfect, they're flawed, they made a lot of mistakes, a lot of stupid mistakes, but they worked really hard and they got really lucky and they persevered.
And you're telling their story, which is so much better than simply lecturing. And that's what I like so much about How I Built This. So what is next? Is there a person or is there an industry that you say, I got to dig into that. I haven't quite done that show yet. What's next, Guy?
Yeah, I mean, one of the industries that we really have not done is gaming. In part because, look, Larry, I'm 45. I'm not a gamer. I played Nintendo when I was a kid, but it was never my thing. My kids are obsessed with it. My kids drive me crazy. And we have a lot of debates about screen time. And not debates is polite. Arguments, drag down fights. But my kids love games. And gaming is a huge industry. It's kind of passed me by, and I have really neglected that. So we are actually going to do an episode about a company that is a major force in gaming called Riot Games. They invented League of Legends. There are really 3 video games that have revolutionized gaming in the last 20 years. It's World of Warcraft, League of Legends, and Fortnite. And those are 3 different companies. So we are profiling the founders of Riot Games to really kind of delve into that world. And I admit in the interview, you'll hear it when the podcast comes out in a couple months, that I'm going to ask questions that make me sound like a complete idiot. But these guys were so patient with me and explained the intricacies and the details. It's a very complex industry. It requires a lot of startup capital. But a really interesting industry and a really interesting story with those guys. So gaming is certainly one area that we will start to look at. But rest assured, if you're not into games, it's not going to be all games all the time. We're going to, we're going to sprinkle it in every now and again.
Guy, who do you want to read this?
I don't want people who only are thinking about starting a business or only starting a business. I want this book to be read by anybody who wants to learn how to think entrepreneurially, because I don't believe you have to hang a shingle out in front of your door to be an entrepreneur. You can work at Babson College and be entrepreneurial. You can work at Disney. You can work at NPR. Apple computers. Apple computers. Johnny Ive invented the iPhone inside of Apple. Who's going to say he's not entrepreneurial? It's a mindset. And I want this book, in some ways, is inspired by Carol Dweck's book, Mindset. I want people to think about entrepreneurship as a mindset, as a way of thinking, and a sequence of tools that you can pull out from your brain toolbox to make you more effective, to make you a better collaborator, colleague, to think more creatively, to solve problems, whether you're working inside a big organization or you're doing it on your own. This book is really designed to be a cheerleader, and the kind of book that you can pick up, especially when you're feeling down, when you're feeling beaten down, and you can open it up and you can say, okay, I got this.
Well, as I said in the Boston Business Journal, I got it and read it in one sitting. It's everything and more. Guy Raz, thank you so much. The book is How I Built This, The Unexpected Paths to Success from the World's Most Inspiring Entrepreneurs. Please get it from your independent bookseller, our sponsor, Wellesley Books. And Guy, thank you so much. We'll look forward to seeing you and hearing you on How I Built This in the future.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you so much.